we would expect the shadow price to be similar, well, correlated with the market price of oil, since the market price is going to be related to marginal cost, shadow price, and potentially a markup. So we would expect the shadow price and the price of oil, if the marginal cost of oil have a similar, don't have large trends in the marginal cost of oil, then we'd expect the shadow price and the market price to have similar shapes. But I do find that the markup is not significant in, I guess, the recent years, since I don't find that there's that much market power in the recent years. So maybe I should superimpose the market price of oil on that particular graph so you can see some differences. So it's not exactly, it doesn't follow the exact same trend, but you're right, it's very similar.
Could I just follow up on that? Because it seems to me completely implausible that it's scarcity of the resource that's driving this pattern to mimic the actual market price of oil in this period, because the changes are so dramatic. On the other hand, the marginal price, say, lifting and finding costs might follow that, simply because of the scarcity of equipment. When the price goes up, everybody wants to have a drill rig and fit out there. So can you distinguish between those two in your model, the actual physical scarcity of oil? I have to say, I'm completely incredulous that it could change in that pattern over time, versus, say, the marginal cost as a consequence of scarcity of equipment for finding and lifting oil.
Right, so I do have cost data that I incorporate in my analysis, but it's unit cost data, so it's not marginal cost data. So the one functional form assumption I do make is I'm assuming that we have constant returns to scale on the cost function with respect to extraction, so the average cost and marginal costs are the same. So this cost does incorporate things such as finding costs and things like that, but you're right that if the marginal costs follow a different trend from the average cost, then I'm not able to separately identify that. Yes?
I noticed that your instrument variable was population, and that kind of surprised me. I thought maybe, this is for the demand side. That's the shifter in the demand side.
Yeah. Yes.
Why would you use something like GDP or some other feature? Perhaps you did.
Yes, I tried doing that. That actually wasn't a very good instrument. So it turns out that controlling for after you control for population, the income, especially if you're tracking, so I had an instrument for total OPEC production, and then so if you use, I guess I tried world income, and then I tried the income of non-OPEC countries as an instrument for non-OPEC production in addition to the population, and they weren't significant.
It's your call.
Oh, do I?
Dr. Kaufman and Dr. Haji.
Okay.
I'm just, of course, surprised at the model and surprised at the results. But let me understand the conclusions. Did you conclude that non-OPEC members have some sort of oligopoly power?
In the first 2 decades of the data set, so prior to 1990, so from 1970 to 1990, I saw some degree of market power, so oligopolistic market power among the OPEC was behaving as if it was at least imperfectly colluding. So in the 70s and 80s.
When the oil was controlled by the international oil companies and price controls were imposed in the United States. Can you explain that?
Well, I guess OPEC did have some control over the prices, especially during there's some people believe that for example, during the oil, the price shocks of the 70s, that it was in part due to OPEC control over the prices. So there's some people who believe that, I guess some work seems to suggest that OPEC did exert some market power over those decades.
So the model basically shows OPEC and non-OPEC are the same?
No, not the same. I actually, I modeled them differently. So the non-OPEC countries were modeled as oligopolists, so they were behaving, each were behaving to maximize their own revenue, or maximize their own per period profits, whereas the OPEC countries were potentially acting as if to maximize joint profits. So the OPEC countries were potentially colluding. The non-OPEC countries were potentially behaving as oligopolists, but not colluding with the OPEC countries, so they weren't the same.
So if you introduce price control, the price control that was in the United States throughout the 70s, the largest oil consumer in the world, and was among the top producers in the world, what would happen to the result of the model?
That's an interesting question. So price controls as in sort of a cap on prices, is that what you mean?
Yes.
Um,
But it was installed in 1971 and continued until 1981.
I guess so. That's an interesting question. So the way I've structured the theoretical model, the choice variable is quantity and not price. But if I had a, let's see, if I had a cap on price, well, so U.S. is one of the non-OPEC countries in my data set. So for the U.S., they wouldn't be following that particular first-order supply side, first-order condition. They just have their price cap, or they'd have a sort of kinked supply curve. So that's an interesting thing I should consider trying to add to the model if that would, since that's a realistic description of the market that I could add to the model to make it more realistic.
Yeah, so I have just a real quick suggestion, and it goes to one of the comments that a previous speaker made in that this is a single equation model. Do you ever think about estimating using co-integration error correction techniques, and that way get rid of the need to use instruments at all? Because that way, it either co-integrates or doesn't, and the error correction tells you which way the disequilibrium is going, and then this whole issue about choosing instruments and just kind of disappears.
I've thought of that. I personally don't have the expertise to do that, but I do know someone. I just met someone at this conference who seems to know a lot about that, so I'd love to talk to you more about it.